Meanwhile, Lucia, a triumphant smile on her face, sped down the dirt road, envisioning her new life of luxury. But the rearview mirror revealed an impossible sight. The albino lion, with astonishing speed, was pursuing her. It wasn't a hungry animal, but a force of nature seeking justice. Panic seized Lucia. She floored the accelerator, but the beast wouldn't give up, its powerful strides echoing behind the car. The fear, once reserved for her victim, now consumed her. On a sharp bend, terrified and disoriented, Lucia lost control. The car skidded violently, colliding with a deafening crash against the sturdy trunk of a centuries-old tree, ending her escape and her greedy plans in a fate imposed by the very nature she had tried to manipulate. The silence that followed the crash was more terrifying than the impact itself. Lucia, dazed, felt her body heavy, trapped between the deformed steering wheel and the seat that pinned her. The smell of burning rubber and twisted metal invaded her nostrils, mingling with the metallic taste of her own blood in her mouth. Her head throbbed, and a sharp pain radiated from her left arm, which seemed to have slammed violently against the dashboard. Her vision was blurry, but the image slowly forming through the shattered windshield was unmistakable. The albino lion. He stood there, a few feet away, motionless. There was no haste in his movements, only a chilling grandeur that froze Lucia's blood. His eyes, an almost supernatural blue, fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to penetrate her soul. It wasn't the blind fury of a wild animal, but the cold determination of a judge. The lion didn't roar, didn't advance. He merely watched, as if waiting for her to comprehend the magnitude of her error, the futility of her escape. Lucia tried to move, but the seatbelt, now a tight noose, held her captive. The panic, once a wave, was now an ocean drowning her. The luxury, the inheritance, the life of ease she so craved all crumbled around her, reduced to smoke and wreckage. The irony was cruel. She had planned her mother-in-law's death to inherit a fortune. And now, nature itself, in the form of a mythical predator, was collecting its debt. With a desperate effort, Lucia fumbled at the dashboard, searching for the door handle, anything that could offer an escape route. But the door was dented, jammed against the tree, an insurmountable barrier. The car, once a symbol of her freedom and power, was now her prison, a coffin of twisted metal. Outside, the lion took a slow, majestic step. Each movement of his powerful paws seemed to echo in Lucia's heart, which beat erratically and painfully. He circled the vehicle, his muscular body brushing against the bodywork, a sound that made Lucia shrink further into the seat. She could feel the warmth of his presence, the wild breath that seemed to carry the scent of the forest and death. Lucia's mind spun in a whirlwind. The arrogance with which she had abandoned her mother-in-law, the certainty of her impunity, all dissolved. The image of the old woman, defenseless in her wheelchair, returned with terrifying clarity. She had laughed at her mother-in-law's fragility, at the idea that the wolves would do the dirty work. Now, she was the prey, and the predator, far more imposing than any wolf, stood there, waiting. The lion stopped again, this time before the driver's window, his blue eyes inches from Lucia's. A low growl, almost a deep purr, vibrated in his chest, a sound not of rage, but of warning, of unquestionable authority. Lucia closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, smudged with dust and blood. She could feel the animal's warm breath on the glass, the contained strength in every fiber of its being. This was the end. Nature, which she had tried to dominate and manipulate, now rose to claim its justice. As Lucia faced her nightmare miles away, the elderly woman was still on the dirt road, but not alone. The lion, in his relentless pursuit, had ensured the wolves kept their distance. They still lurked in the shadows of the forest, their yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness, but the scent of the great feline kept them at bay. The old woman, though exhausted and confused, felt a strange peace in her daughter-in-law's absence and in the protective presence of the albino giant who, for a brief moment, had become her unexpected guardian. Fate, or perhaps the forest itself, had woven a web of retribution and salvation where the cruelty of a rich daughter-in-law found its mirror in the righteous fury of a wild king. Lucia, trapped in her destroyed car, felt the weight of that justice descend upon her. With every second the lion watched her, patient, relentless. Time seemed to have folded in on itself, stretching seconds into an eternity of dread. Lucia, breath caught in her throat and heart pounding like a discordant drum, felt the albino lion's gaze pierce her soul. There was no explicit rage in his blue eyes, but a chilling depth, an ancient wisdom that seemed to comprehend each of her heinous acts. The silence was terrifying, broken only by the slow drip of some fluid from the damaged engine and the distant hum of insects, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding. Trapped in her coffin of twisted metal, Lucia tried to move again. The searing pain in her left arm made her groan, but the fear of the lion was greater than any physical agony. She tried to reach for her cell phone, perhaps in a desperate attempt to call for help, but the device was out of her reach, fallen on the car floor, beneath the tangle of cables and debris. The driver's door, dented and jammed, was an insurmountable barrier, a cruel reminder of her helplessness. The smell of gasoline mingled with blood and panic, creating a nauseating cocktail that suffocated her. The lion, as if reading her futile thoughts, took another slow step. His front paw, enormous and powerful, touched the dented hood of the car. It wasn't a blow, but a subtle touch, almost a caress, that made the bodywork groan, and Lucia let out a muffled scream. That simple gesture carried an implicit force, the promise of destruction that could materialize at any moment. The beast didn't need violence to assert its dominance. Its mere presence was a sentence. Lucia closed her eyes again, trying to push away the image of the lion, but it was etched in her mind. The arrogance with which she had planned her mother-in-law's death, the coldness with which she had abandoned her, all came back now to haunt her. She imagined the old woman, alone on the road, at the mercy of the wolves, and a shiver ran down her spine. The irony was brutal. She, the hunter, had become the prey, and the predator was far more imposing than any animal she could have imagined. With her eyes still shut, Lucia heard a sound. It wasn't a roar, but a deep growl vibrating in the lion's chest, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It was a warning, a declaration of intent. She opened her eyes, and the lion was even closer, his majestic head inches from the shattered window glass. The blue eyes, once chilling, now seemed to glow with an almost supernatural intensity, as if reading her every darkest thought. The lion then did something unexpected. He didn't attack. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and with frightening delicacy scraped one of his claws on the remaining window glass, producing a sharp, chilling sound. It wasn't an attempt to break the glass, but a symbolic gesture, a demonstration of his ability to do so, of his contained strength. Lucia felt terror transform into pure despair. She was completely at the mercy of that mythical creature. As Lucia faced her personal purgatory, miles away, the elderly woman in the wheelchair felt the change in the air. Her daughter-in-law's absence was a relief, but the quiet of the forest, once filled with the lion's scent, now seemed emptier. The wolves, who had kept their distance, began to move again in the shadows. Their distant howls, once muffled by the albino giant's presence, now seemed closer, more audible. The great feline scent, though still present, began to dissipate, and with it, the invisible barrier that protected the old woman. The old woman, though weak, felt a shiver. She knew the lion had left, carried away by his own mission of justice. Now she was alone again, and the yellow eyes gleaming in the forest's darkness were a cruel reminder of her imminent fate. Fate, which for a brief moment had given her a guardian, now seemed hesitant, leaving her once more at the mercy of the wild. Back at the destroyed car, Lucia watched the lion. He stepped back one pace, then another, circling the car again. There was no haste in his movements, only an implacable certainty. He seemed to be assessing the situation, deciding the next step of his punishment. Lucia knew there was no escape. The forest, once the setting for her crime, was now the stage for her own condemnation, and the albino lion, her judge and executioner. She had underestimated nature, and now nature was collecting its price, with a patience and ferocity that far surpassed her own cruelty. The silence that followed the lion's movement was filled only by the sound of her own ragged breath, awaiting the inevitable. Time, once a rushing river, was now a stagnant swamp, each second dragging into an eternity of dread. Lucia, breath caught in her throat and heart pounding like a discordant drum, felt the albino lion's gaze pierce her soul. There was no explicit rage in his blue eyes, but a chilling depth, an ancient wisdom that seemed to comprehend each of her heinous acts. The silence was terrifying, broken only by the slow drip of some fluid from the damaged engine and the distant hum of insects, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding. Trapped in her coffin of twisted metal, Lucia tried to move again. The searing pain in her left arm made her groan, but the fear of the lion was greater than any physical agony. She tried to reach for her cell phone, perhaps in a desperate attempt to call for help, but the device was out of her reach, fallen on the car floor beneath the tangle of cables and debris. The driver's door, dented and jammed, was an insurmountable barrier, a cruel reminder of her helplessness. The smell of gasoline mingled with blood and panic, creating a nauseating cocktail that suffocated her. The lion stopped on the passenger side, his blue eyes fixed on the dented door. With calculated slowness, he raised his front paw and placed it firmly on the door handle. There was no brute force, just constant pressure, but the twisted metal groaned under the weight. The door, already jammed, yielded a millimeter, then another, with a metallic screech that seemed to tear the air. Lucia watched, paralyzed, terror transforming into a cold acceptance of her end. The lion wasn't trying to open the door to attack her, but to expose her, to reveal her fragility, her insignificance before the force of nature. He was dismantling her prison, not to free her, but to show that she had nowhere to hide. The handle, already damaged, cracked and broke under the relentless pressure of his paw. The lion then withdrew his paw, and the door, though still jammed, was now visibly looser, a symbol of her exposed vulnerability. He looked at Lucia again, and this time there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't just judgment, but a kind of disdain, as if she were unworthy of his full wrath. He had done his part, showing her the mirror of her own cruelty. With one last penetrating gaze, the albino lion slowly turned, and without a roar or any other sound, began to walk away, disappearing into the forest darkness as silently as he had appeared. Lucia remained there, trapped in her destroyed car, her body trembling uncontrollably. The lion was gone, but the terror he had instilled remained. She was alone, injured, and the passenger door, now partially open, offered no escape, but rather a clear view of the dark forest, full of sounds and shadows. She could hear the wind whispering through the trees, and in the distance, a solitary howl, not of a wolf, but seeming to carry the melancholy of the forest itself. The lion had left her there, not to die immediately by his claws, but to face a much greater solitude and despair, a punishment that would extend through every minute of her existence. She had desired inheritance, freedom, and now she had only the forest, the silence, and the memory of her crimes as company. Miles away, the old woman heard the howl. It wasn't the howl of the wolves surrounding her, but a different sound, deeper, more distant, that seemed to echo the lion's departure. She felt a chill, not just from the cold of the night, but from the certainty that her guardian had left. The wolves' yellow eyes, once hesitant, now gleamed with new audacity. They were closer, their low, guttural growls mingling with the sound of the wind. The old woman closed her eyes, smelling the damp earth and the wild breath of the predators. Fate had played with her, offering a glimpse of salvation only to snatch it away. She was once again at the mercy of the forest, alone, but with a strange resignation. The lion's justice had manifested, but her own battle was far from over. The silence that followed the albino lion's departure brought Lucia no relief. On the contrary, it was a heavy silence, filled with the echo of her own ragged breath and the frantic beating of her heart. The beast's absence did not mean the end of her nightmare, but rather the beginning of a new chapter of terror, where the threat was less tangible, but equally overwhelming. The lion had left her there, injured and helpless, to face the forest, the night, and above all, herself. The smell of gasoline and blood, once muffled by the panic of the lion's presence, now dominated her senses, mingling with the damp, earthy odor of the forest. Lucia tried to move again, but the pain in her left arm was excruciating, and her right leg seemed trapped under the twisted dashboard. Every movement was agony, a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. Her cell phone, still out of reach, glowed faintly on the car floor, a useless beacon in her sea of despair. The passenger door, now ajar, was a crack into the abyss. The darkness outside was almost palpable, dotted only by indistinct points of light that could be eyes or just deceptive reflections. The wind whispered through the trees, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, transformed into a sinister omen in Lucia's mind. She was alone, completely at the mercy of the nature she had so arrogantly underestimated. The lion had not killed her, but had condemned her to a slower, more agonizing death, where fear would be her executioner. A new wave of dread hit her. What else lurked in those shadows? If the lion, the king of the forest, had moved away, what other predators might be lurking? The forest was not an empty place. It was a pulsating ecosystem, and she, Lucia, was now just another element in its food chain. The irony was a slow poison. She had planned her mother-in-law's death to get rid of a burden, and now she herself was the burden, trapped, helpless, awaiting her own fate. Lucia closed her eyes, trying to block out the darkness and the menacing sounds, but the images of her deeds returned with redoubled force. Her mother-in-law's frightened face, the sound of the car driving away, the coldness of her own heart. All of this now transformed into ghosts that haunted her in the oppressive silence of the destroyed car. She felt a chill that did not come from the cold of the night, but from the icy terror settling in her soul. As Lucia drowned in her personal purgatory miles away, the elderly woman in the wheelchair felt the presence of the wolves intensify. The distant howl she had heard before, the one that seemed to carry the melancholy of the forest, was now a chorus of wild voices, closer, more urgent. The lion's scent, her temporary guardian, had almost completely dissipated, and with it, the invisible barrier that protected her. The yellow eyes, once hesitant, now gleamed with renewed audacity, forming a tight circle around her. She could hear the dragging of paws on the damp earth, the low, guttural growl that vibrated in the air, promising violence. The old woman, though weak, raised her head, her own eyes fixed on the dancing shadows. She had faced death many times in her life, but never with such palpable certainty of her imminent end. One of the wolves, the largest and darkest, stepped forward, its fangs exposed in a silent snarl. The animal's wild breath hit the old woman's face, a smell of meat and earth that made her shiver. She could see the cruel intelligence in the predator's eyes, the hunger that drove its every movement. There was no pity there, only the relentless law of nature. The old woman clenched her fists, feeling the weakness in her limbs, the pain in her joints. She was alone, defenseless, an easy target. Fate, which for a brief moment had beckoned her with the hope of salvation in the form of the albino lion, now seemed to laugh at her naivety, delivering her back into death's cold embrace. She closed her eyes for an instant, not in resignation, but in an attempt to gather her last strength, to face the inevitable with the dignity that remained to her. When she opened them again, the wolf was even closer, just a few feet away, its muscles tense, ready to attack. The other wolves, like a hungry pack, waited for the signal, their shadows lengthened by the faint moonlight. The forest, once a refuge of peace, had become a hunting ground, and the old woman the prey. Time, once a stagnant swamp, now flowed like a rushing river toward the precipice. The battle for the old woman's life, which the lion had delayed, was about to begin, and this time there was no guardian in sight. Back at the car, Lucia heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind, nor the crackling of branches. It was a heavy, dragging, a sound that seemed to come from under the car, or perhaps from the forest, much closer than she would have liked. Her eyes widened in the darkness, trying to discern any shape, any movement. The air grew colder, and a shiver ran down her spine. The lion had left, yes, but the forest still had its own judges, its own executioners. And Lucia, trapped in her metal coffin, felt that her condemnation was just beginning. The heavy dragging intensified, no longer an indistinct sound, but a rhythmic cadence of paws on the damp earth. Lucia held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic drum in her chest. It wasn't a solitary animal. There were several. The smell, once just of earth and dampness, now mingled with something wilder, denser, a canine odor, but with a ferocity she had never felt before. And then in the gloom, the eyes, dozens of them, glowing with a yellowish, hungry gleam, emerging from the shadows like live embers in the darkness. Wolves, the pack she had destined for her mother-in-law, now surrounded her. The irony was a punch to the gut, a poison spreading faster than fear. She had planned her death in the jaws of these predators, and now she was the one trapped, the smell of her own blood and panic acting as an irresistible invitation. Miles away, the old woman felt the alpha wolf's breath on her face. Its fangs, sharp as daggers, were inches from her throat. She closed her eyes, ready for the impact, for the final pain. But the impact didn't come. Instead, a deeper, more urgent growl echoed through the forest. It wasn't from the wolf in front of her, but from somewhere distant, a sound that seemed to tear the veil of night. The alpha wolf, with an abrupt movement, raised its head, its ears tensing, picking up something human senses couldn't. The other wolves, forming the tight circle, also reacted, their growls diminishing to a murmur of uncertainty, their heads tilted in the same direction. There was something in the air, a change in the forest's atmosphere that had distracted them. A new scent, perhaps, or a sound only they could decipher. The circle loosened slightly, the tension decreasing, but not disappearing. The old woman opened her eyes, confused. The alpha wolf was still there, but its attention was divided. It sniffed the air, its yellow eyes now fixed in one direction beyond the dense forest. Salvation, however brief, had arrived in an unexpected form, a whim of fate that kept her hanging by a thread. Back at the destroyed car, Lucia watched the wolves. They weren't just observing, they were investigating. The largest of them, an imposing male with dark fur and piercing eyes, approached the passenger door, the same door the lion had dismantled. He sniffed the twisted metal, the smell of gasoline, and more intensely, the smell of blood that seeped from Lucia's injured arm. His rough tongue passed over the broken handle, and Lucia felt a shiver of repulsion and terror. Other wolves began to test the windows, scratching the glass with their claws, leaving white marks on the fogged surface. The low, guttural growls, once distant, now resonated inside the car, amplified by the metal. Lucia tried to retreat, but she was trapped. Her right leg, still immobilized, throbbed with searing pain, and her left arm bled freely, an olfactory beacon for the predators. She could feel the hot, wild breath of a wolf that approached the driver's window, its eyes fixed on hers, without a hint of fear or hesitation. It was a primordial hunger, a cruel intelligence that studied her, assessing her weakness. She was the prey, and they, the hunters. Her mind reeled, searching for an exit, a weapon, anything. But there was nothing. The forest, once the setting for her crime, was now her coffin. And the wolves, her gravediggers. The lion had left her to face herself, but the forest was not so philosophical. The forest wanted meat, and she was the offering. The sound of metal being scratched became more insistent. One of the wolves, bolder, began to bite the front bumper, testing the car's resistance as if it were a carcass. The smell of gasoline, once merely an annoyance, now seemed a warning, a ticking time bomb. If they managed to puncture the tank, a spark would be the end. But ironically, she wasn't afraid of fire. She was afraid of the fangs, of the slow pain, of the humiliation of being devoured alive. She had despised her mother-in-law's life, thrown her to the wolves, and now the law of retribution manifested with poetic cruelty. Fate was not blind. It was an implacable judge. She closed her eyes again, not to escape, but to concentrate, to find a strength she didn't know she possessed. But she found only emptiness, despair. Her cell phone, still on the floor, seemed an object from another world, a symbol of a life she had lost forever. Reaching for it was impossible, an agony she couldn't bear. She was alone, completely alone, and the sound of the wolves became the requiem of her existence. For the old woman, the unexpected pause was a miracle. The alpha wolf, though still vigilant, had stepped back, and the other wolves, though still present, no longer formed the menacing circle. They were restless, sniffing the air, looking east, in the direction from which the distant sound had come. It wasn't a howl, nor a roar. It was a more complex sound, a mix of twisted metal, shattered glass, and a scent carried on the wind, gasoline and blood. The smell of the accident. Lucia's smell. The old woman realized that the wolves' distraction was not an accident, but a direct consequence of the events unfolding miles away. The same force that had protected Lucia from the lion now exposed her to other dangers, and these dangers, in turn, were drawing the wolves away from her. It was an intricate web of cause and effect, where every action generated an unpredictable reaction. She was still in danger, yes, but the imminent attack had been postponed. She used the moment of truce to breathe deeply, to try to calm her heart. The forest was still a dangerous place, but for a brief instant, death had retreated. She looked in the direction the wolves were sniffing, and an image formed in her mind. Lucia's car, destroyed, and her daughter-in-law facing her own hell. A poetic justice, perhaps, but one that did not remove her from immediate danger. The wolves, though distracted, were still there, and hunger, she knew, was a force that could not be ignored for long. Lucia, for her part, had no luxury of distraction. The wolves were around the car, and one of them, the alpha, began to scratch the driver's door, right next to her head. The sharp sound of metal being torn was deafening, and she could feel the vibrations through the seat. The sharp claws tried to find a crack, a weak point. She could see the strength in their movements, the determination in their eyes. It was no longer a distant threat, it was a palpable reality. She was trapped, injured, and with each passing second, hope diminished. The lion had left, but had left behind a death sentence executed by a hungry pack. The forest, with its sounds and smells, had become her purgatory, and the car, her coffin. Lucia closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, smudged with blood and dust. The end was near, and she knew there was no escape. Nature, in its silent fury, was collecting its price, and the debt was her own life. The twisted metal of Lucia's car groaned under the incessant attack. The alpha wolf, with a ferocity that transcended mere hunger, tore at the driver's door with its claws, each blow a deafening echo in the small, claustrophobic space. Lucia could feel the vibrations through the seat, as if the car were a wounded animal, trembling in its last breaths. The wolf's yellow eyes, inches from hers, gleamed with a cruel intelligence, a promise of pain and annihilation. There was no longer the surprise of the attack, only the inevitability of the hunt. While the alpha focused on the door, other wolves, younger and equally hungry, began to test the car's limits. One of them leaped onto the hood, its paws scratching the metal with a sharp, irritating sound. Another, bolder, began to bite the rearview mirror, shattering the glass with a dry snap. The smell of gasoline, once a mere annoyance, now permeated the air, mingling with the wild odor of the wolves and the iron tang of Lucia's blood. It was a suffocating cocktail of danger, a constant reminder that her time was running out. Lucia tried to retreat, but she was trapped. Her right leg, immobilized, throbbed with searing pain, and her left arm bled freely, an olfactory beacon for the predators. She desperately searched for an exit, a weapon, anything that could offer a chance, however infinitesimal. But there was nothing. Her cell phone, still on the floor, seemed an object from another world, a symbol of a life she had lost forever. Reaching for it was impossible, an agony she couldn't bear. She was alone, completely alone, and the sound of the wolves became the requiem of her existence. The metal of the driver's door yielded slightly, and Lucia felt a shiver of terror. A crack opened, and the alpha wolf's damp snout squeezed through, its eyes fixed on hers, without a hint of fear or hesitation. It was a primordial hunger, a cruel intelligence that studied her, assessing her weakness. She was the prey, and they, the hunters. The forest, once the setting for her crime, was now her coffin, and the wolves, her gravediggers. The lion had left her to face herself, but the forest was not so philosophical. The forest wanted meat, and she was the offering. Miles away, the old woman observed the wolves' restlessness. The unexpected pause was a miracle, but a fragile one. The alpha wolf, though still vigilant, had stepped back, and the other wolves, though still present, no longer formed the menacing circle. They were restless, sniffing the air, looking east in the direction from which the distant sound had come. It wasn't a howl, nor a roar. It was a more complex sound, a mix of twisted metal, shattered glass, and a scent carried on the wind, gasoline and blood. The smell of the accident. Lucia's smell. The old woman realized that the wolves' distraction was not an accident, but a direct consequence of the events unfolding miles away. The same force that had protected Lucia from the lion now exposed her to other dangers, and these dangers, in turn, were drawing the wolves away from her. It was an intricate web of cause and effect, where every action generated an unpredictable reaction. She was still in danger, yes, but the imminent attack had been postponed. She used the moment of truce to breathe deeply, to try to calm her heart. The forest was still a dangerous place, but for a brief instant, death had retreated. With the little strength she had left, the old woman tried to move. The wheelchair was damaged, a wheel twisted, the seat torn. Every movement was agony, a protest from her tired muscles and aching bones. She tried to drag herself away from the clearing to the protection of the denser trees, but the uneven ground and the darkness made the task almost impossible. Her fingers scraped the damp earth seeking support, but with every inch gained, the pain increased. Despair threatened to swallow her, but the image of the albino lion, however distant, lit a small flame of hope in her chest. She couldn't give up. Not now. The wolves, though still sniffing the air in the direction of the accident, began to show signs of impatience. Their low, guttural growls returned, more frequent, more insistent. The smell of the old woman's fresh blood, however faint, was still in the air, a tempting invitation. The alpha, with an abrupt movement, turned its head, its yellow eyes fixing again on the fragile figure on the ground. The distraction had been useful, but hunger was a force that could not be ignored for long. The circle, once loosened, began to tighten again, slow, inexorable. Back at the car, Lucia felt the alpha wolf's snout push through the crack in the door, and one of its sharp fangs scraped her shoulder. A scream of terror escaped her throat, mixing with the predator's victorious snarl. The smell of her own blood, now more intense, seemed to madden the wolves. The car, her refuge, was about to be violated. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, smudged with blood and dust. The end was near, and she knew there was no escape. Nature, in its silent fury, was collecting its price, and the debt was her own life. The sound of metal tearing became the last sound she expected to hear before the inevitable. The metal shrieked, a final tortured protest, as the alpha wolf's head, now fully thrust into the door's fissure, became a nightmare reality. Its yellow eyes, once merely menacing, now burned with triumphant hunger, reflecting the shattered fragments of Lucia's world. She felt the animal's hot, foul breath on her face, a nauseating mix of raw meat and damp earth. The sharp fangs, which had already grazed her shoulder, now sought a more vulnerable spot, tearing through the fabric of her blouse. Then the soft skin beneath. This was no longer a threat, it was the executioner's blade. The scream that tore from her lips was not of rage, but of pure primordial terror, the sound of a soul shattering, of a life being violently ripped away. The other wolves, galvanized by the sound of yielding metal and Lucia's scream, intensified their assault on the car. Paws scratched at the windshield, leaving spiderweb cracks, while powerful snouts tested the integrity of the side windows. The vehicle, already a twisted tomb, now trembled violently under the relentless siege, each impact a hammer blow against Lucia's coffin. The pungent smell of gasoline, mingling with her own blood, and the wild musk of the wolves, created a suffocating miasma, a potent harbinger of her end. She tried to push the alpha away, but her left arm, weakened by the injury, was useless, and her immobilized right leg pinned her helplessly to the seat. It was a losing battle, a last desperate act of resistance against nature's overwhelming and indifferent force. Her eyes squeezed shut, not in resignation, but in a futile attempt to block out the image of imminent death. Yet, the sensations, the searing pain, the suffocating smells, the terrifying sounds were too real, too immediate to be ignored. The wolf's fangs grazed her neck, a warning, a promise. Meanwhile, miles away, the old woman felt the circle of death tighten around her once more. The brief truce, a fragile breath of hope, now dissipated like smoke in the wind. The guttural growls, once distant, had coalesced into a sinister, suffocating chorus. The alpha wolf, its gaze unwavering, had turned its attention completely back to her. There was no longer the distraction of the distant accident, only implacable, primordial hunger. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she tried to drag herself towards the denser, more protective shadows of the forest. Her hands, already raw and bleeding, scraped the damp earth, seeking a purchase that stubbornly eluded her. The damaged wheelchair, her former ally, now lay like a grotesque, inert weight, a cruel reminder of her utter vulnerability. The biting cold of the night, the chilling dampness of the ground, the excruciating pain radiating from her back and legs, all conspired to crush her will, to extinguish the last embers of her struggle. But the vivid image of the albino lion, majestic and fiercely protective, still flickered in her mind, a stubborn spark of defiance. She could not surrender. She would not allow Lucia, even in death, to have the last uncontested word. She needed to fight, not just for her own survival, but for a justice that remained unfulfilled. The circle of wolves contracted, and she could feel the radiating warmth of their bodies, the musky scent of their fur growing stronger, more invasive. One of them, a younger, impatient wolf, took a daring step forward, a low, guttural growl reverberating in its chest. The old woman closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable impact, for the final, perhaps merciful pain. This was it, the end. Then a shadow impossibly vast and swift burst from the deepest part of the darkness. It was not a wolf, it was a colossal, shimmering white mass, a ghost forged of mist and raw power. The air vibrated with a roar that made the very earth tremble beneath her. A sound not just loud, but primordial, charged with ancient, untamed fury. The wolves who moments before had been confident, relentless predators, froze mid-stride. Their snarls dissolved into whimpers of pure terror, their bodies tense in a mix of fear and instinctive submission. The young wolf that had dared to advance was swatted aside with a paw so blindingly fast it was barely a blur, falling into the undergrowth with a yelp of pain. It was him, the albino lion, back, his eyes an icy, piercing blue, fixed on the stunned pack. And there was no ambiguity in his intent. He was not there to hunt, he was there to protect. The wolves, their predatory instincts overridden by a deeper, older fear, understood the message implicitly. The brutal hierarchy of the forest had been unequivocally re-established by a superior, unquestionable force. One by one, tails between their legs and eyes wide with terror, they began to retreat, melting back into the impenetrable darkness from which they had emerged. The clearing fell into an almost deafening silence, broken only by the old woman's ragged, uneven breathing and the faint, distant groan of twisted metal. A miracle, a second chance, but for how long? Lucia, many miles away, heard no roar of salvation. For her, the world had shrunk to the snarling snout of the alpha wolf inside her car, its fangs now tearing her flesh, a burning pain blossoming in her shoulder and neck. The sound of metal ripping, of fabric shredding, of her own skin being punctured, became the final agonizing crescendo of her life. The darkness she knew was coming. The silence that followed the lion's roar was not a relief, but a suspension of the world's breath. The forest, which moments before had been a chorus of threats, now seemed to hold its breath, watching. The old woman, stretched out on the cold, damp ground, felt her heart pound in her chest, a frantic drum echoing in her ears. She slowly opened her eyes, her vision blurred by pain and dry tears. The colossal white form of the albino lion was there, a spectral guardian, his majestic silhouette against the gloom of the night. His blue eyes, once icy and menacing, now seemed to carry an ancient depth, a primordial wisdom that went beyond simple predation. He was not there to hunt. He was there to protect. The wolves had disappeared. There were no more growls, no musky scent of their bodies. Only the cold night air and the aroma of pine and damp earth. It was a miracle, a second miracle, and the old woman felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost made her faint. With a monumental effort, she tried to move. Every muscle protested, every bone ached, but the flame of hope lit by the lion burned with renewed intensity. The wheelchair, her former ally and now a twisted burden, lay a few feet away, a cruel reminder of her physical vulnerability, but also of the distance she had traveled in her struggle for life. Her raw fingers scraped the earth, seeking support. The cold penetrated her thin clothes, but an inner strength, a fierce determination propelled her. She could not surrender, not now, not after being saved by such a magnificent creature. The image of Lucia, of the cruelty in her eyes, of the indifference in her voice, resurfaced in her mind. Justice, she realized, was being served. Lucia, miles away, was facing the fury of the same nature she had tried to manipulate. The distant smell of gasoline and blood, the faint and intermittent sound of twisted metal were silent proof that Lucia's fate was unfolding. And it was not a fate of inheritance and impunity. The albino lion, with a slow and calculated movement, turned his head. His blue eyes met hers again. This time, there was something more, a kind of silent recognition, almost a permission. He was not a pet, nor an angel, but a force of nature that had chosen to protect her. And that protection, she knew, was not an accident, but a direct consequence of the intricate web of events unfolding in the forest. The same force that had driven the wolves away from her now directed them towards Lucia. The old woman began to drag herself inch by inch towards the denser protection of the trees. The pain was excruciating, but with every movement, every gasp, she felt a renewed will to live. She needed to survive. Not just for herself, but to witness the end of this saga, to see justice fully served. The forest, once a labyrinth of horrors, now seemed a silent sanctuary, watched over by an improbable guardian. Meanwhile, many miles away, Lucia's world had been reduced to a private hell, a stage where nature collected its debt with interest of blood and terror. The alpha wolf's snout, once a distant threat, was now completely inside the car, its sharp fangs tearing Lucia's flesh with relentless ferocity. The pain was a fire consuming her body, each tear a new explosion of agony. Her screams, muffled by the pack's roar and the sound of metal breaking apart, were mere whispers of despair. Her shoulder was raw, blood cascading down her arm, soaking the leather seat. The wolf's fangs sank into her neck, a deep bite that made her gasp, the air thinning in her lungs. Her vision blurred, a smear of yellow eyes and sharp teeth, the foul smell of the animal's breath mixing with her own blood and the gasoline leaking from the tank. The car, her luxury refuge, was being dismembered around her, every window shattered, every door ripped off by the wolves' brute force. The other wolves, galvanized by the smell of fresh blood and the alpha's frenzy, attacked the vehicle with savage fury. Paws scratched at the windshield, leaving spiderweb cracks, while powerful snouts tested the integrity of the side windows, which yielded with a screech of shattering glass. Lucia felt a searing bite on her leg, flesh being torn away in a paroxysm of pain that made her scream again. A hoarse, desperate sound lost in the cacophony of growls and howls. She tried to fight, but her body was broken, her will crushed. Her injured left arm was useless, and her immobilized right leg pinned her to the seat like a sacrifice. There was no escape. Darkness began to envelop her vision, sensations becoming distant, unreal. In her last moments of consciousness, a fleeting image of the old woman, abandoned on the road, flashed in her mind. There was no regret, only a cold, brutal understanding of the irony. Nature, in its implacable indifference, was collecting its debt, and the debt was her own life, paid with interest of terror and blood. The sound of metal ripping, of fabric shredding, of her own skin being punctured, became the final, agonizing crescendo of her existence. The darkness, she knew, was coming to take her, and this time there would be no albino lion to save her. The darkness, she knew, was coming to take her. And this time there would be no albino lion to save her. The final sound of a bone cracking, a muffled scream that turned into a gurgle, and then silence, a silence that was not of peace, but of satiation. The cacophony of growls and howls that had filled the accident clearing began to subside, replaced by more guttural, more primitive sounds. The tearing of flesh, the cracking of bones, the voracious licking. Lucia, the woman who had planned her mother-in-law's death with such coldness, was now just another feast in the merciless forest. Her luxurious car, a symbol of her power and control, lay like a twisted metallic carcass, its entrails exposed, the expensive leather soaked in blood and the shattered windows reflecting the gloom of the night like empty eyes. Nature, in its implacable indifference, had collected its debt with interest of terror and blood. Miles away, the old woman continued her desperate struggle. Every inch was a victory, every gasp a silent prayer. The albino lion, her improbable guardian, kept a respectful distance, a colossal, vigilant shadow. His blue eyes, which seemed to see through the darkness and the soul, fixed on her, not with the ferocity of a predator, but with a stillness that bordered on protection. The old woman felt the lion's presence as an invisible shield, a barrier against the horrors the forest might still hide. She dragged herself towards a cluster of dense bushes, her raw hands finding roots and sharp stones. Pain was a constant companion, but the image of Lucia, of the cruelty in her eyes, now mingled with a sense of dark justice. There was no triumph, only the realization that the scales had been balanced. The cold of the night intensified, biting her exposed skin and penetrating her bones. She needed shelter, warmth, a moment of rest that seemed a distant fantasy. The smell of pine and damp earth was now punctuated by a more subtle but unmistakable aroma of blood and twisted metal, carried on the wind. It was the distant echo of Lucia's fate, an icy reminder that the forest did not forgive. The old woman, with the last drop of her strength, managed to crawl under the dense foliage of a low bush, which offered minimal protection against the biting wind. She huddled, trying to conserve the little warmth left in her body, her ragged breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The albino lion, with an almost imperceptible movement, approached a little closer, lying down a few feet from the bush, his majestic form merging with the shadows. He was not a pet nor an angel, but a force of nature that had chosen to protect her, and his presence was a silent comfort amidst the despair. The old woman closed her eyes, exhausted but not defeated. The struggle for survival continued, but now there was a new clarity. Lucia was no longer a threat. The inheritance, the money, all that Lucia had coveted, and that had led her to ruin, seemed insignificant now. Her only goal was to survive, to find a way out, and perhaps, just perhaps, to understand the purpose behind the lion's intervention. Meanwhile, in the accident clearing, the wolves' frenzy began to subside. The sounds of chewing and possessive growls became more sporadic. The car's carcass, once an enclosure of metal and glass, was now a pile of wreckage, its inner parts exposed to the night. The smell of blood was overwhelming, mingling with the pungent odor of gasoline and oil. The wolves, with blood-stained snouts and eyes gleaming in the darkness, began to disperse, dragging pieces of their prey into the forest shadows. The alpha wolf, with a final snarl of dominance over what remained of the vehicle, turned and disappeared into the darkness, followed by the others. The clearing fell into a sepulchral silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant howl of a solitary wolf. Lucia's luxury car, now a monument to her arrogance and downfall, lay under the faint moonlight, a grim reminder of the price of cruelty. Inside it, what remained of Lucia was a horrifying, unrecognizable sight, consumed by the same nature she had underestimated. There were no more screams, no pleas, only the quietude of death. The forest had claimed its prey, and the relentless cycle of life and death continued, indifferent to human dramas. Dawn approached, promising to bring light to a scene of devastation, but also a new chance for the old woman, who, protected by her albino guardian, awaited the sunrise with renewed hope, but exhaustion weighing on every fiber of her being. The journey was far from over, but the greatest threat had been neutralized by the forest itself. The gloom of dawn began to yield, not with a burst of light, but with a gradual softness that tinged the sky bluish-gray. Under the precarious protection of the bush, the old woman felt the night's cold give way to a denser humidity, the forest's dew. Her muscles, stiff and sore, protested with every slight attempt at movement. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak, but consciousness, slow and stubborn, returned, bringing with it the vivid memory of the night's horrors, and the imposing image of her guardian. She opened her eyes, which burned and were swollen. The faint light revealed the web of branches and leaves above her, a natural ceiling that for now protected her. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was strong, mixed with the distant metallic aroma that the wind still carried, the echo of Lucia's end. There was no triumph in her heart, only a dark quietude, the realization that the scales of justice, though brutal, had been rebalanced. With a monumental effort, she turned her head. There he was, the albino lion, a few feet away, lying with his head resting on his paws, his blue eyes fixed on her. There was no threat, only a silent, almost protective vigilance. He was a creature of mystery, a wild angel who had appeared from nowhere to intervene in her destiny. His presence was an invaluable comfort, a tacit promise that she was not completely alone. The old woman tried to move her legs, but the pain was searing. Her right leg, in particular, seemed unresponsive, a dead weight that pinned her to the ground. Her hands were raw, covered in dirt and small cuts. Her throat was dry, scratching with every breath. Hunger and thirst began to manifest, demanding her attention. Surviving the night was one thing, surviving the day, injured and lost, was an entirely different battle. She knew she couldn't stay there. The morning cold would soon dissipate, and the sun would bring with it other dangers, other forest creatures. She needed to find water, a safer place, perhaps a path. But how? Every inch of her body cried out for rest, for relief, but determination, that same inner strength that had propelled her the previous night, rekindled. Lucia had tried to kill her, but nature had intervened. Now, it was her turn to fight, to prove that life was stronger than cruelty. With a muffled groan, she began to drag herself again. Every movement was torture, a test of her resilience. Her raw hands grasped at roots and stones, pulling her heavy body forward. Her right leg dragged lifelessly, a burden that made progress agonizingly slow. The albino lion, without making a sound, raised his head and watched her. His blue eyes seemed to follow her every effort, a silent witness to her struggle. She dragged herself a few feet, stopping to catch her breath, her heart pounding erratically in her chest. The sun began to filter through the treetops, creating beams of light that danced on the foliage. The forest, once a stage of terror, now revealed its wild and indifferent beauty. Birds began to sing, and the hum of insects filled the air. Life continued, oblivious to the human tragedy that had unfolded there. The lion, with surprising grace for his size, stood up. He did not move away, nor did he come too close. He simply moved, maintaining a constant distance like a silent guide watching her closely. He seemed to understand her need to move, her urgency to find a way. It was as if he were escorting her, not to a specific destination, but simply out of that point of vulnerability. The old woman looked at him, mute gratitude in her tired eyes. He was not a pet, nor an angel, but a force of nature that had chosen to protect her. And that protection, she knew, was not an accident, but a direct consequence of the intricate web of events unfolding in the forest. The same force that had driven the wolves away from her now directed them towards Lucia. With every new effort, every inch gained, the old woman felt a renewed will to live. She needed to survive, not just for herself, but to witness the end of this saga, to see justice fully served. The forest, once a labyrinth of horrors, now seemed a silent sanctuary, watched over by an improbable guardian. The journey would be long and painful, she knew, but now the most immediate threat had been neutralized. Lucia was no longer a problem. The wolves had been sated. All that remained was the forest in its implacable vastness, and herself, a woman wounded but not broken. And, of course, the albino lion, a colossal and vigilant shadow who seemed to be the manifestation of nature's own will. Hope, fragile as a flickering flame, began to warm her heart, urging her to continue, one painful drag at a time towards the unknown. The forest, with its secrets and dangers, still awaited her, but now she had an unexpected ally. The forest, with its secrets and dangers, still awaited her, but now she had an unexpected ally. Each drag was a symphony of pain, a muffled groan lost in the birdsong. Her right leg, a dead and useless weight, dragged across the damp ground, tearing at her already raw skin. Her hands, bleeding, clutched at twisted roots and sharp stones, pulling her exhausted body forward inch by agonizing inch. With every effort, her breathing grew louder, her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and cold sweat streamed down her forehead, mingling with dirt and exhaustion. The sun, which had timidly filtered through the canopy, now rose in the sky, transforming the morning dampness into a suffocating heat. The forest, which had seemed a sanctuary in the gloom, now revealed itself in its fullness, a green and imposing labyrinth where every shadow could hide a new threat. The incessant hum of insects filled the air, and the sweet, heavy scent of decaying leaves mingled with the metallic aroma of dried blood that still permeated her clothes. Thirst, once an annoyance, transformed into a searing agony, scratching her throat and drying her mouth. The albino lion, her silent guardian, stayed ahead, a majestic silhouette moving with impossible grace for his size. He didn't roar, didn't rush her, but simply stopped, turned his head, and fixed his deep blue eyes on her, as if inviting her to follow, to continue the arduous journey. It was an inexplicable connection, a dance of survival between a woman on the verge of collapse and a wild beast that had chosen to be her guide. She felt his presence not as a burden or a threat, but as an anchor, a tacit promise that she was not completely alone in that green hell. With a renewed breath of determination, she continued to drag herself, her eyes fixed on the white figure moving ahead. Pain was a constant fog, but the image of Lucia, of the cruelty in her eyes, now mingled with the sight of the car's wreckage, a grim reminder that justice, however brutal, had been served. There was no triumph in her heart, only a heavy quietude, the realization that the scales had been rebalanced, and somehow the lion was part of it, an instrument of nature itself. Suddenly, the lion stopped. He didn't turn around, but his ears moved, picking up sounds she couldn't hear. The old woman, her heart pounding, stopped too, her body trembling with exhaustion and apprehension. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any roar, a dense silence charged with expectation. She tried to listen, but her ears buzzed, and the only thing she could distinguish was the frantic beat of her own heart. The lion then made a subtle head movement, indicating a direction, and continued to walk, but now with redoubled caution, his muscles tense beneath his white coat. She followed him, dragging herself with renewed urgency, the fear of being left behind overcoming the pain. The vegetation began to change, becoming denser, the trees taller, forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight, creating a cooler, darker environment. The ground became softer, covered by a thick layer of leaves and moss. The smell of damp earth intensified, and for a moment she thought she smelled a different aroma, something fresh and inviting. The lion stopped again, this time beside a cluster of moss-covered rocks. He turned to her, and his blue eyes seemed to glow with an unusual intensity. With a slow, deliberate movement of his head, he indicated a specific spot among the rocks. The old woman, her vision blurred and her mind clouded by exhaustion, forced herself to look, and then she saw a thin, crystalline trickle of water flowing between the rocks, forming a small puddle at the base. Water. The word echoed in her mind, a promise of life, of relief. With a groan of gratitude, she dragged herself the last few feet, ignoring the searing pain in her legs and hands. The lion watched her, motionless, like a marble statue. When she finally reached the puddle, she plunged her trembling hands into the cold water, feeling immediate relief on her parched skin. She brought her hands to her mouth, drinking in small sips, each drop a balm for her dry throat. The water was pure, fresh, the best she had ever tasted in her entire life. She drank until her thirst subsided, feeling life slowly return to her veins. Then, she wet her face, wiping away the dirt and sweat, feeling a refreshing coolness. Mental clarity began to return. She looked at the lion, who still watched her with the same protective stillness. He had guided her there, had saved her from thirst, just as he had saved her from the wolves. Who was he? A guardian, an angel, or just a force of nature that for some reason had become linked to her destiny? The gratitude she felt was immense, but there was also a pang of apprehension. What would come next? The water was a temporary relief, but she was still injured, lost, and in the middle of a merciless forest. The journey was far from over, but now, with her thirst quenched and the lion's presence by her side, hope, once a flickering flame, burned with renewed strength. She needed to survive, not just for herself, but to understand the purpose behind all of it, to witness the end of this improbable saga. The forest continued to be a mystery, but now she had a guide, a protector, and an unbreakable will to live. The coolness of the water, a balm for her parched throat, brought momentary relief, a welcome truce in the battle against exhaustion. But reality, relentless, soon reasserted itself. Her thirst had subsided, but the pain in her raw hands, her useless leg, and every muscle in her body persisted, a constant symphony of agony. The mental clarity that hydration had provided only served to accentuate the magnitude of her misfortune. She was injured, lost, and the forest, though now less hostile in daylight, was still a vast and indifferent labyrinth. The albino lion, her silent guardian, watched her with an intensity that seemed to transcend mere animal curiosity. His blue eyes, once a harbinger of danger, now radiated a strange wisdom, a tacit promise that her journey would not end there, in that small oasis of rocks and moss. He was not a pet, nor a companion in the human sense of the word, but a force of nature that had aligned itself with her destiny, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. With a heavy sigh, the old woman gathered the strength she had left. The water had given her new breath, but the path ahead was still uncertain, and every inch gained would require a Herculean effort. She dragged herself away from the puddle, her body protesting with every movement, her right leg a heavy and painful burden. The lion, with his majestic grace, turned and began to walk away slowly, casting a glance back, as if inviting her to follow him. There was no haste in his movements, but a silent determination that urged her to continue. The vegetation grew denser, the ground more uneven. Twisted roots and sharp stones were constant obstacles, and each time her raw hands grasped them, a pang of pain shot through her body. The sun, now high, filtered in sparse beams through the treetops, creating a play of light and shadow that made the forest even more mysterious. The hum of insects was a constant soundtrack, and the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air, a wild and primordial fragrance. She thought of Lucia. The image of the destroyed car, the wolves, nature's brutal justice came to her mind. There was no rejoicing, only a dark quietude. Lucia had sown cruelty, and the forest had reaped what she planted. It was a cycle, a balance that rebalanced itself in ways the human mind could barely comprehend. The lion, she realized, was part of this rebalancing, an instrument of a greater force operating beyond human understanding. Her own survival, she knew, was a testament to that same force, a refusal to yield to the darkness. The lion stopped again, this time at the foot of a small rise. He looked at her, and his blue eyes seemed to communicate a silent message. The path would be difficult, but not impossible. With a monumental effort, the old woman began to climb the incline, pulling herself up with her arms, dragging her body and her useless leg. Every inch was a victory, every breath a challenge. The damp earth and slippery leaves made progress difficult, and the fear of falling, of rolling back down, was a constant shadow. When she finally reached the top, exhausted and gasping, she allowed herself a moment to rest, her heart pounding erratically in her chest. The view that opened before her was of a wild and untouched beauty, a verdant valley, dotted with majestic trees and cut by a silver stream that meandered in the distance. The air was fresher there, and the birdsong seemed more vibrant. The lion, who had waited patiently for her, began to descend the opposite slope, towards the stream. It was a gentler descent, but still treacherous for someone in her condition. The old woman followed him, hope, once a flickering flame, now a burning fire in her chest. The stream's water meant not only more hydration, but perhaps the possibility of a path, of an animal trail that could lead her out of that green labyrinth. As she dragged herself, her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of civilization, any indication that the forest was not her end. Pain was a constant, but the will to live, to witness the end of her own saga, to understand the purpose behind all of it, was even stronger. The lion, a colossal and vigilant silhouette, continued ahead, her improbable guide, her silent protector. The forest, with its secrets and dangers, still awaited her. But now she had a clearer objective, a direction, and the certainty that she was not alone. The journey was far from over, but with each painful step she drew closer to a destiny that, though uncertain, seemed less grim. There were still dangers, she knew. The forest was merciless, and night would soon fall, bringing with it new threats. But for now, there was water, a guide, and an inner strength that refused to be broken. She had to survive. She had to. The descent towards the silver stream, though less steep than the previous climb, was a new torment. Every movement was a battle against gravity, and the searing pain radiating from her useless leg. Her hands, already raw, clutched at exposed roots and loose stones, each contact sending a shiver of agony through her body. The lion, ahead, moved with a supernatural elegance, his steps silent and calculated, as if dancing with the forest itself. He stopped occasionally, turning his head to ensure she was still following, his blue eyes a beacon of vigilance in the growing gloom. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and shadows lengthened, transforming the trees into ghostly figures. The air, once fresh, now carried the premonition of night, a damp cold that penetrated her bones. She knew that night in the forest was a danger in itself, a veil that hid predators and amplified fear. But the sight of the stream drawing ever closer was a promise of relief, a reference point amidst the green vastness. The water, she thought, was not just for drinking, but for washing wounds, for perhaps finding a path. With one last, desperate effort, she slid the final feet, falling gently onto the soft bank of the stream. The sound of rushing water was a calming melody, a welcome contrast to the constant buzzing in her ears. The stream was wider than it appeared from a distance, its crystalline waters reflecting the dying sky. She dragged herself to the edge, plunging her hands into the cold current. The water was icy, but the coolness was a balm for her inflamed skin. She washed her face, her hands, feeling the dirt and dried blood detach. The clarity the water brought was not just physical, but mental. The lion lay down a few feet from her, observing the surroundings with unwavering attention. His blue eyes, now almost luminous in the gloom, swept the forest, catching every sound, every movement she could not perceive. He was a wall of protection, a silent guardian against the invisible threats the night would bring. The gratitude she felt for him was profound, an emotion that transcended reason. He had not abandoned her, had not left her behind. He was her only hope. As the last trace of light disappeared behind the trees, the forest transformed. The daytime sounds of birds and insects gave way to a darker chorus, the rustling of leaves, the distant snap of branches, the solitary howl of an animal in the distance. The cold intensified, and she felt her body tremble uncontrollably. She needed shelter, warmth, but where? The forest was a dense tangle, with no obvious caves or crevices. The lion, as if reading her thoughts, stood up. With a nod of his head, he indicated a denser area of bushes and fallen trees, a tangle that might offer some protection from the wind and the curious eyes of the night. She followed him, dragging herself again, every fiber of her being protesting. They reached a small recess, formed by a fallen trunk and thick bushes. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The lion lay down at the entrance, his massive body forming a barrier against the outside world. She huddled as much as she could, trying to conserve the little warmth left in her body. Pain was a constant companion, but fear now was more pressing. What would the night bring? The wolves, she knew, would not be far, and there were other predators, creatures of the darkness she could barely imagine. Her thoughts returned to Lucia. The image of the destroyed car, of life draining away amidst smoke and twisted metal. There was no joy, no vengeance in her heart, only a deep sadness for how it had all ended. Lucia had been consumed by her own greed, and the forest, with its implacable justice, had collected its price. It was a grim reminder that nature cared nothing for fortunes or inheritances, only for balance, for life and death. The lion let out a low growl, a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. She looked at him, and his blue eyes were fixed on some point in the darkness. His ears moved, picking up something she could not hear. The old woman's heart pounded. Something was out there. Something was approaching. The lion's growl intensified, a clear warning, a veiled threat. The air grew denser, charged with a palpable tension. She huddled even further, trying to make herself the smallest possible target. The lion was her only defense, her only hope. Night had fallen, and with it, the true challenges of the forest. She closed her eyes, praying for a strength she didn't know where it would come from, but which she knew she would need to survive those hours of darkness. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves now mingled with a wilder aroma, a predator's scent that made her hold her breath. The journey was far from over. The fight for life, she realized, was just beginning. The lion's growl reverberated in the darkness, a guttural sound not of rage, but of a primordial warning. The air, already heavy with the night's dampness, grew dense with an almost palpable tension. She smelled it even before she saw it, a wild, pungent aroma that made her hold her breath, the scent of predator, of hunt, of imminent death. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, tried to pierce the curtain of darkness, but the forest was an impenetrable shroud. The lion stood, his colossal body an imposing silhouette against the faint starlight that filtered through the treetops. His blue eyes, once a beacon of vigilance, now gleamed with fierce intensity, fixed on a point beyond human sight. The growl intensified, transforming into a low, continuous snarl, a vibration that seemed to shake the very ground. She huddled even further, her heart pounding erratically in her chest, each beat a drum of fear. Then they appeared, not all at once, but like shadows detaching from the darkness, pairs of yellow, glowing eyes that floated among the trees. Wolves, the pack Lucia had hoped would devour her. Their distant howls had transformed into low, menacing growls, a chorus of hunger and opportunism. There were 3, perhaps 4, slinking with the caution of experienced hunters, their lean, muscular bodies barely visible in the gloom. The smell of flesh, of vulnerability had drawn them. The albino lion, however, did not retreat. On the contrary, he took a step forward, his snarl growing in volume, an unmistakable declaration of dominance. His white mane, now almost silver in the darkness, bristled, and he bared his teeth, sharp, deadly canines. It was a spectacle of raw power, one force of nature confronting another. The wolves hesitated, their eyes fixed on the white giant. They were predators, yes, but they were also intelligent, and the sight of the lion, so large, so imposing, was a clear warning. One of the wolves, what appeared to be the leader, took a step forward, a defiant growl in its throat. But the lion did not wait. With a roar that made the trees tremble and the air vibrate, he advanced a meter, a swift and decisive movement. It was not an attack, but a show of force, a warning that this territory, this prey, was under his protection. The roar echoed through the forest, a sound that spoke of power and fury, of an unbreakable will. The wolves, however hungry they were, understood the message. The easy hunt they expected had turned into a dangerous confrontation with a far superior predator. Slowly, one by one, they retreated, their yellow eyes still fixed on the lion, but the defiance in their growls had diminished. They turned and disappeared into the darkness as silently as they had appeared, leaving behind only the scent of their presence and the echo of the lion's roar. The silence that followed was almost more frightening than the presence of the wolves. The old woman trembled uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The lion, however, remained in his position, vigilant, his blue eyes still sweeping the darkness. He did not lie down immediately, as if he knew that the danger, though repelled, had not completely disappeared. Night in the forest was an endless succession of threats and vigils. The hours dragged on, each minute an eternity of cold and fear. She huddled even further, her body aching and exhausted, but her mind hyperactive. She thought of the cruel irony. Lucia had left her for the wolves, and a lion had saved her from them. The scales of the forest's justice, she realized, operated in ways that defied human comprehension. There was no room for greed or malice here, only for survival and balance. When the first rays of sun began to tinge the sky a pale grey, an immense relief washed over her. The birdsong began to replace the night sounds, and the forest, once a place of terror, slowly regained its wild beauty. The cold was still intense, but the light brought with it a promise of warmth, of a new day, of a new chance. The lion, who had finally lain down a few hours earlier, stood up. He looked at her, and his blue eyes seemed softer now, reflecting the light of dawn. With a nod of his head, he indicated the stream and then the opposite slope, which seemed to open to a less dense area of the forest. It was an invitation, a sign that the journey continued. With renewed effort, the old woman dragged herself out of the makeshift shelter. Every movement was agony, but the sight of the rising sun and the lion's presence propelled her. She washed her face in the stream, the icy water invigorating her, and drank until her thirst was quenched. The clarity of the water seemed to wash away not only the dirt, but also some of the fear and despair of the night. The lion guided her up the slope, this time by a gentler path which wound through a clearing. The air was lighter there, and the smell of pine and fresh earth replaced the heavy aroma of the night. As they advanced, the vegetation began to thin, and the ground became less uneven. There was a faint trail, perhaps of animals, perhaps of hunters, that opened before them. The lion stopped on an elevation where the forest opened to a wider view. In the distance, through a morning mist, she could distinguish a straighter line, a cut in the landscape that was not natural, a road, and beyond, a faint metallic glint, perhaps the roof of a house or a car. Civilization. A wave of emotion hit her, so strong that her legs gave way. Tears, which she had not shed in days, streamed down her raw face. She had survived. She had reached the end of that nightmare. The lion turned to her, his blue eyes fixed on hers. There was no haste in his gaze, only a deep quietude, a silent understanding. It was as if he knew his mission was over. He had been the guardian, the guide, the instrument of a greater justice. With one last look he turned, and with the same majestic grace with which he had appeared, disappeared into the density of the forest, a white shadow merging with the morning mist. She stood there for a long time, watching the spot where he had vanished, immense gratitude filling her heart. He was a mystery, a miracle, a living legend who had crossed her path in her darkest moments. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she began to drag herself towards the road. The pain was still there, but now it was a reminder of her resilience, of her will to live. The inheritance, the fortune, all that Lucia had coveted and that had led her to ruin seemed insignificant now. Her true wealth was life, breath, the sun on her face, the chance for a new beginning. Hours later, a forest ranger patrol car, alerted by reports of a crashed car and a search for a missing elderly woman, found her. She was dirty, injured, but alive. Her story, told with a hoarse voice and tear-filled eyes, would be met with disbelief, but the truth was etched in her soul. She had faced the darkness of nature and the darkness of the human heart, and she had emerged. The forest had collected its price from Lucia and had offered her, the abandoned old woman, a second chance. Guided by an albino guardian who defied all logic, life, she knew now, was a precious gift, and nature in its fury and in its grace was the greatest teacher of all. She had survived, and that was her true inheritance.